What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Best Books Podcast, an Orchard Hill Church podcast that helps you choose your next book. In this world, there's so many different books that we could read, and there's only so much time in our busy lives. And so this podcast exists to help us choose books that not only enrich us, not only give us information, but help us toward life transformation. My guest today is a father, a husband, a lover of fiction, and a podcaster himself. Please welcome to the show for episode 8, Tyler Thomas. Tyler, how's it going?
Yeah, it's great. It's good to be on an official Orchard Hill podcast.
Yeah,
it's going to be good.
The wonderful people on YouTube can see your face. Tyler is doing so much behind the scenes that goes unnoticed, but something tells me that's the way you like it.
Yeah, it's kind of good to be under the radar. I don't like to be the center of attention usually, but when we're talking about a good book, that's always I'll come out and have a good chat. So
yeah, totally. Tyler, I thought of you whenever we started Best Books because I know that you do your own sort of podcast on the side. So why don't you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's called Pages of Light, and it's just focused on talking about fantasy and science fiction novels from a Christian worldview. Haven't had one up in a little while though, because it's just been kind of crazy with life and all those kinds of things. But
because I'm sure for the past year you've been preparing for Best Books, right? That's why you haven't produced anything.
Yeah, that's right. I've just been waiting for Jonathan to ask me to be on the podcast, so I'm fresh and ready to go because it's been a while since I've recorded an actual podcast on mine. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. Were you offended when I asked Katie before I asked you?
No, but I was kind of like, man, I wish I was on the Best Books podcast, and now here I am, so it's going to be really great.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. I think pretty much everyone on staff has that feeling.
They're just waiting for you to ask. Yeah,
I would feel so lucky to be on the Best Books podcast. So tell us a little bit about your family, speaking of Katie.
Yeah, so Katie, she's the director of kids ministry. She is my wife, and we've been married for almost 5 years now, and we have one son. His name is Jack. And he is about 18 months right now, so almost 2, I guess, depending on when they're going to be hearing this podcast. So, yeah, that's pretty much us. We live in Zelienople right now, but we did actually just, we're about to close on a house that's over in Valencia, so that's kind of the new big thing happening in our life, and yeah.
Yeah, totally.
That's pretty much me.
Wonderful. That's an exciting stage in the life of your family.
Yeah.
How did you guys get connected initially with Orchard Hill?
Yeah, so I started attending after college in 2015. My family had attended here every so often because I played hockey growing up, and some of our games were on Sunday mornings, so we couldn't attend church. And so sometimes we would come here on Saturday nights, and so I was already familiar with Orchard Hill. And so I just started attending. I joined a small group. And then Katie and I started dating a little bit after that, and then she started attending with me, and then about a year later, I joined staff. So, yeah, and I've just been here ever since, and yeah, it's been great to be part of the mission and vision of the church here. So,
sure. What was it when you were just attending before you worked here that really kind of made you stick and try to see what Orchard Hill was all about?
Yeah, initially I think it was just having the big young adult program here, and because my church that I had attended growing up, they didn't really have much for young adults. Like after you kind of graduate college, they have like the youth group for high school kids, and then whenever you get to college, it's like, okay, now you're just going to be in like adult church, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't really like a community of young adults that I could get to, meet some new friends and new people. And so that was what initially drew me. And then getting into a group obviously is just a really big thing to meet new people and to go deeper in your faith and have new friends and relationships. The person I do my other podcast with is actually somebody that I met through that young adult program all those years ago. So just kind of goes to show you that you can meet people in groups and have lifelong friendships and do more things with them throughout the years. So.
Well, totally. Well, that's a really great segue into talking a little bit more about Pages of Light and how that started. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. Yeah, I think it was just like I was looking for content about fantasy and science fiction books and like what do those things talk about from a Christian perspective, and I wasn't really finding anything in the online space, and so I was just like, well, I'll just do it myself. And I've always just thought it would be cool to make YouTube videos and be a content creator of some kind, and just kind of putting my own spin on that whole thing. And that's just kind of how it started. Initially, I would just do like reviews of books, or I did some comic books as well, because those are shorter and they're easier to kind of create a piece of content for instead of a 300, 400 500 plus page fantasy novels, sometimes they can get pretty big, and so it's a long time to read them and then go over all of the content and have something meaningful to say. So a comic book is kind of shorter in that way. And then, I don't know, the podcast just kind of started because I wanted to do kind of those longer form videos, and I feel like a podcast format would be better for those longer fantasy novels, whereas like maybe one video, you'd have to do a bunch of them to really do a particular work justice. And I just asked my friend if he was interested because he likes fantasy and science fiction as well. So, and it just kind of, grew from there. So
that's awesome. Well, I think you're going to be a perfect fit for the book that we're going to be talking about today. Yeah. When I thought about having you on, I thought about doing a fiction book sort of from a Christian perspective. And so today we're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis's book, Out of the Silent Planet, the first of 3 books often referred to as the Space Trilogy. And as we discuss this book, we'll also be talking about sort of a macro view of how fiction can ultimately point to faith. And so I'm really excited for this discussion. Tyler, what's your journey been with fiction as a whole? Have you always enjoyed it, or is that more of an adulthood thing?
No, I think ever since I was little, I enjoyed reading fiction. My dad would read me and my brothers the Chronicles of Narnia, like before we were going to bed, as like a bedtime story. So I remember reading about the first book, Magician's Nephew, with the pools where the kids go into and they're transported into different worlds and all these different things. And I always thought that was really cool. And so that was probably my first, vivid memory of, reading fiction or fantasy. And then just growing up, the Lord of the Rings movies came out, and so those were a really big influence on me. And I watched those movies, and then I was like, wow, that is such an amazing story. And so I had to read the books, and so I read all of those. And then throughout the years, I read other things like the Redwall books by Brian Jakes. And then later on, when I got to college, I was reading other things like the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. And then like now I'm reading through the Wheel of Time. So just kind of as I've grown up, I've gotten more exposed to different fantasy series, and those series have kind of grown in complexity as I've gotten older.
Sure.
So that's kind of been my journey.
Yeah, maybe put an end to the debate, because you always hear people talk about books versus movies. Are the books always categorically better?
I think in general they are better, just because the author knows exactly what he wants to tell, and whenever you do like an adaptation of that thing, it's sometimes hard to just translate all of those things into a movie format. But I think with the Peter Jackson trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, he did a really good job of keeping like the spirit and the themes of the books, which is what I think you really have to focus on when you're doing adaptation, is to keep the heart of what the author was trying to tell in that story. And then if you can keep that at the center of your adaptation, then that will lead you generally to a good kind of adaptation of a book into a movie or TV show format. So, but yes, generally I think the books are better in most ways. So.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion about it either way? Or?
I do. I think, I just read Harry Potter, and so I think those books are better than the movies, which is funny because I was the same way with you in Lord of the Rings. I watched the movies first, and only recently, just this past year, read the books. And I think there's something about the feeling you have when you read a fiction book. There's just sort of the excitement you have going through the story. It's hard to capture that when you're sitting down and doing the story start to finish, like in a movie. When you're reading through the book, you can kind of, you read it in different places and at different times, and you can sort of remember the feeling you had, if nothing else. Whereas in the movie, it's impossible, I think, to capture that exact same feeling. But I think what you said is so true about trying to capture the essence of the same story. What can you tell us as we transition a little bit to this book? What can you tell us about C.S. Lewis as a writer, or maybe the Space Trilogy more specifically? Is this trilogy held in high esteem in the fiction community, or is it more well-known just in Christian circles?
Yeah, I think it's probably more well-known in Christian circles. I don't really see a lot of, I guess, book YouTuber type people talking about the Space Trilogy. I think it might be more talked about in like Christian philosophical circles, because the book is kind of a little bit more philosophical in nature and less about like, action-heavy things. So I don't know that it's like looked down upon by other people, but I don't think it's as popular as some of the big series like The Wheel of Time or Lord of the Rings or things like that have really had a more transcendent experience in the culture and things like that, where it's mass appeal and those kinds of things. And there hasn't been an adaptation or something for the Space Trilogy, so that kind of affects that as well. So,
Yeah, which is kind of a shame because I think I'd see that over like
Yeah.
Interstellar.
It would be
There's so
interesting.
many space movies that have come out in the past
Sure.
10 years.
Yep.
It's kind of amazing it hasn't happened. But that probably just reflects how little known it really is in the zeitgeist. But
Right.
yeah, I find it really interesting because I think you're the one that pointed this out, that this book was actually, or the series was actually written before we went into space ourselves. And
Right.
so
It was like 1938 or something like that.
yeah, so I think that's really fascinating. I think now that I've read it, just the detail he gives to what it must be like going to space, having
Right.
never gone himself.
And even talking about like the science of it, like when in the spaceship and how they went into and how long it's going to take and all of these different things. So
Yeah.
he did his research for sure.
Totally. Before we get specifically any more into the book, I'm curious about just one of these high-level questions. What do you think our relationship with fiction should be? Does it add anything, or is it one of those things where, hey, if you enjoy it, read it, but if not, you're not really losing out on anything?
Okay, right, yeah. I would recommend people read some fiction. There is definitely, and I think as Christians, you can read all types of fiction from a specifically Christian worldview. And so, when you're reading about, characters or stories or events that are happening, you can filter all of those things from your Christian perspective. And you can also put yourself in the places of those characters when someone is doing or making X decision, like what would you do in that situation? And, since you're a Christian, how would you react in those ways? And you can kind of filter those events from your biblical perspective and make judgments about how does this speak into my own life? And if I was put in this situation, how would I react? And so I think, when you read fiction, you can kind of put yourself into the place of a lot of different people and a lot of different experiences that you wouldn't otherwise have because you're only just yourself and you're living in your own world. But if you read fiction, you can be transported to, a whole new world and a whole new set of experiences that you would never be able to have in the real world. And that can just kind of open your mind to like a new way to view situations and how to respond in those ways from a particularly biblical perspective. So
Yeah, I like that. It can sort of open your mind into asking questions that you might not have already asked. But since this fictional person's going through it, you don't even have to go through it. You can go through it sort of through them. I think that's something interesting about the Bible as a whole is that we got to be really careful because I don't want to slip up and say that the Bible is fiction.
Right.
But the Bible does indeed have a lot of narrative, which is story,
Right.
especially in the Old Testament. And so I've thought about this a lot recently, that so many of the principles and the theology of the New Testament, you can actually look back in the Old Testament and see that almost in story form. You look at David and Saul, and you see what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 about the God using the foolish things in the world to shame the wise, and you see that on display. And I would argue that you see it in brighter color in the actual story of David and Saul, as opposed to if we just had the New Testament and we just had the theology. So along those same lines, I think we as Christians, we can look at fiction, even ones that weren't explicitly written from a Christian perspective, and we can see certain principles that are universal because of the universal nature of the Bible.
Yeah.
Tyler, getting more into the broad arguments of the book, what do you think C.S. Lewis is trying to really say in Out of the Silent Planet? What are some of the key points or the deeper points within the realm of this fictional world?
Sure, yeah. I think at a broad perspective, I think he's basically trying to create a contrast between our world and this fictional world that we're being transported to. And Ransom is kind of, he's the Earth person, and so he's kind of viewing this new world as like we would view it from our perspective. And so we're getting his interactions with the people of this world, and he's kind of trying to show us what a world might be like that isn't, corrupted by the devil. And, the people that are in this world kind of live in peace and harmony with each other because they're, ruled by a higher power, whereas in our world, the devil is over control, and we're still in our sin. And so there's just a stark contrast between Earth and this place, which is called Malacandra. I don't know if we've said that yet. So I think that's kind of the broad kind of picture of what he's trying to paint with this story. And then it's kind of like Ransom's experience. He's the main character as he goes through the world and interacts with all these different characters, getting different perspectives on, how they view the world and kind of their own theologies in their world. So that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah,
Do you have anything to add?
I think it's fascinating because you see you see so much in Ransom, who is the main character, his confusion at these people he's coming across, because even in the questions he's asking and the confusion of the people he's coming across, because one of the broader arguments is that sin leads to fear of lack, you know, and so Ransom's basically saying, well, do your people never war with each other? Do they never fight? Is there no conflict? And he's confused about this because as a resident of Earth, that we have sin. He's only used to conflict. He's only used to this sort of turmoil because people fear not having enough. And so in this fictional planet where they have more than they could ever really want, they don't really deal with that sort of thing. So it's a fascinating thought experiment, if nothing else. You know, what would it be like to go to another planet where sin doesn't exist, and how would I trade the technological advances for those relational advances that would happen because of the peace of not having a sin-stained Earth?
Right.
I think it'd be helpful at this point to probably just recap sort of part of the story, because we're already talking about so many plot points. Basically, I'll go through it very quickly. So the first thing that happens is we have this description of this guy named Ransom. The things that I really remember were that he was tall. He's a philologist, which means he studies sort of the nature of human languages, and he's single. He has like a sister. He doesn't really have much family, which makes him a great candidate to go on this space adventure, because
a lot of hero adventures are like orphans or like single, or they don't have any attachments. They're allowed to go on these grand adventures, you know. Yeah,
totally. And the first real plot point is he tries to save this young man who's sort of in this at his workplace, and he goes into this workplace and he's kidnapped by these two guys named Weston and, is it pronounced Devon or Divine? Is there any like?
Yeah, I think initially I was saying it Devine, but then I was like, maybe it is just Devon.
Yeah, we'll just say Devon because that's a lot easier. It's spelled Devine, which probably shows our confusion.
Which is classic fantasy trope, like weird names that you can't pronounce, and you spend the whole book wondering if you were pronouncing it correctly.
See, this is why you're here, because I would not know these things. That's perfect. So he's kidnapped. They travel through space, and one of the most interesting points is when he actually hears their plan, and he starts to fear that he's going to be some sort of human sacrifice. And so he's on the way to this distant planet. He has all this fear. The conflict is really rising. And then they land on, would you say Malacandra? Is that how we're saying it?
That's how I've been saying it.
Yeah, we're going to use the soft A, which is, we find out, is just the planet Mars, this planet right next to Earth. Ransom thankfully escapes Weston and Devon, and he meets this guy named Hyoy, who is a Xhosa, or however you explain it. Xhosa, yeah. He learns their language. Ransom is then called by sort of the leader of the planet. That's where we're going to stop. So basically, all you need to know is that Ransom is this Earthling who is on this planet called Malacandra, and he's interacting with three different sort of humanoid people groups. You know, they're not exactly animals. They have language. And I thought that was a really interesting thought experiment as well. You know, what would it be like to have different kinds? You know, we have different races, but different anatomically structured kinds of people.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's one of the other things in the book. Tyler, what were some of your favorite moments in the book?
Yeah, I think just all of the different conversations that he has with all of the various characters. Him asking them questions about just what life is like there, like their kind of theological perspective on things, and he keeps asking them this question about like does the Cerrone, that's another one of the species that are there, do they rule over you or do you rule over them? And then they like don't understand this question, like nobody rules us, it's only the guy upstairs that rules us, which is called Oyarsa.
Oyarsa, that's how we're going to say it. Yeah.
That's what we're going to say.
That's the easiest name in this whole book, surprisingly.
On my other podcast, we always joke that we need someone to have the audiobook and someone to read the actual book. So we get the pronunciation and we get the spelling together. But yeah, I think it's just all the conversations, because that's really what this book is centered around, is just Ransom's conversations with all of the different characters. So he talks with peoples of each of the different races, and then he talks with Oyarsa later on in the novel, which is kind of getting to the climax. But I think it was just all of those conversations that were really interesting, and then also just kind of seeing his perspective on, and like him describing all of the different places in mitochondria and just describing what it looks like, and because it's a lot of exploration of the actual physical space and exploration of the people groups and the culture that is there as well. So I think those were kind of my favorite parts of it. Did you have any favorite things
Well,
about
unfortunately, all my favorite parts would kind of spoil the book. That's the tough
that's
part
true.
about reviewing a fictional book. I'll leave it at I really loved the interaction with Oyarsa and just there's a moment in the book, like any great book, where there's a turn, and everything that the author has set up for you in the first half, you find out because that's what any good author writing from a third person limited perspective, which is Ransom's perspective. Right. You find out that his perspective is based in sin and fear and what he's already known. Right. And there's good news for him when he the more he gets to know this planet, the more he falls in love with it, the more he realizes, man, a lot of my fears were sort of unwarranted. And so that's a good way to sort of transition us into looking at some of the more religious themes of Out of the Silent Planet. Anyone knows about the author C.S. Lewis knows that he is a Christian, and so it's no surprise that he'd be writing with some religious themes in mind. Were there any that sort of jumped off the page at you that you thought, there's not a lot of subtlety there, or did you feel like most of them were pretty subtle?
I think, I don't know, if you've been a Christian for a while, I think they'll probably jump out at you pretty quickly. But yeah, it just seems like there's, you have kind of Oyarsa, which kind of seems at the beginning like a God figure, but might be something different, because there's also a character called Meladil, which seems to be like God the Father. So there seems to be some kind of Trinity system going on here as well. You learn
more and more about the religion
it kind of expands
of the world
as you read along. So I think there's like Oyarsa, which is kind of like he's kind of like the overseer of the planet, and so each planet kind of has an Oyarsa
like
all
king,
their own.
Basically.
Yeah, and so like someone that rules over that particular world, and then each planet in the solar system has their own. And then we come to find out that the one that would rule over Earth is the bent one, which is a kind of direct correlation to Satan, who was the fallen angel who used to be good and now is bad. And so that's like a very direct parallel to Christianity. And so that was that's probably the biggest one that stands out to me.
Yeah, the place where there's no subtlety is just talking about bent humans. And I thought, really, when you're running across this word bent, you could probably substitute into sinful. But I thought that was a very clever way of, because I think if a non-Christian were to read this book and see that word sin, I think they would automatically say, well, I'm not going to be influenced by this. But this is just sort of his way of sneaking that in there and saying, the earth is sinful and we are bent in a lot of our ways. Right. And basically all he means by that is we, the way that we go about things is really not the correct way. And we have been sort of poisoned in thinking that, and living our lives in fear because of the devil's influence. And so really the whole book is this thought experiment of what if there were people on all these sort of planets and only our planet was the one that had sin? What if all these other planets were not sort of affected by sin? Right. Tyler, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but as we close, I think it's important to talk about Orchard Hill Church. And so if you were talking to someone who had an interest in fiction, would you recommend this book, or is there another book as far as like seeing that entrance into a love for fiction? What would you say? Sure.
If you wanted to stay with C.S. Lewis, I would probably recommend Narnia first. That's a little bit easier of an entry. This book is a little bit more philosophical and maybe slower moving compared to like those kinds of stories. But yeah, I think if you really do like space travel and like kind of like first contact kind of books of a human going to another planet, then this would be a really good place to start, especially if you're looking for something that's explicitly Christian fiction. That has those direct parallels to things. So this would be a good place to start. I guess other places, you could always start with Tolkien. The Hobbit is a great place to start for anyone who wanted to get into fantasy, and The Lord of the Rings, of course. If you wanted something of a more modern recommendation, Brandon Sanderson is a pretty popular fantasy writer right now, and he has a book called Warbreaker, which is just a standalone book. It's not a part of a series or anything, which makes it really easy to get into. And so that would be another recommendation if you wanted to get into fantasy.
Yeah, wonderful. As we close, I'm curious, we talked about this a little bit up top, but if someone was debating reading a fiction book or a nonfiction book, what do you think Christians can get out of fiction books that nonfiction books can't really do for them?
Right. I think it's just like a different way of looking at situations and events where you can get put into the place of another person and see things through their eyes. And as compared to like, if you're just reading like a history book, it can feel a little boring, like, wow, I'm just reading this old history book about things that happened long ago. Whereas if you're reading something with fiction, it can feel a little bit more exciting and engaging, and you're along for the ride and along for the journey with this character that you may resonate with. Maybe they have a particular character flaw that is similar to something that you're struggling with, and you can kind of go along on this journey with them as well, and then you can experience, how they go through the ups and downs of the journey. And then maybe that can speak into your own life of how you would deal with those situations. And then it can also, point to things about from a biblical perspective of how you would, approach things in a different way. Or maybe it points to something about the human experience and why we need the gospel in our own life. So those would be some things I would say.
Yeah, awesome. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Taylor, thanks so much for coming on. Before you go, I'd love for you to just, if someone is curious about, looking at Pages of Light, how would they find it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you could if you just go to YouTube or search on any podcast app, just search Pages of Light, and it'll probably pop up. It's a little yellow logo with black text, and yeah, we've done a bunch of different books. We've done some Brandon Sanderson. We did Dune by Frank Herbert, which is a big science fiction book, and then we're doing Wheel of Time as well. So lots of stuff to check out there, and they are pretty long podcasts. They're like almost 2 hours, so just be prepared whenever you see that. So
yeah, fair warning. Well, thanks so much again. We really hope you enjoyed this conversation of best books. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to Orchard Hill Plus for more podcasts like this from Orchard Hill Church. If you really like this episode, we'd love for you to tell us by writing a review on Apple Podcasts, or for our YouTube viewers to write down a comment on the video below. Your reviews and comments really help other people sort of find these videos and videos like these. Please join us next month as we talk to Student Ministries Devon Kelly about a book called So the Next Generation Will Know by Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace. My name is Jonathan Thiede, and this has been Best Books. Until next time.